education aims to provide accessible, quality, and relevant basic education to every Filipino nationwide. To realize this vision, the DepEd launched Sulong Edukalidad, a campaign to improve the basic education system of the country by focusing on 4 priority areas: K-12 curriculum review and update, improvement of the learning environment, teacher upskilling and reskilling, and engagement of stakeholders for support and collaboration. As a contribution to the teacher upskilling and reskilling pillar, and in preparation for the next cycle of the Program for International Student Assessment, or PISA, the department presents you with a professional development program on Assessment and Emerging Literacies with focus on PISA. The Assessment PD program is a professional development program that aims to improve teachers' assessment literacy and content knowledge in order to develop reading, math, and science literacy of junior high school students. The program is jointly developed and delivered by DepEd's Office of the Secretary, Bureau of Education Assessment, Bureau of Learning Delivery, and the National Educators Academy of the Philippines accredited learning service providers, namely the Assessment Curriculum and Technology Research Center, Front Learners Incorporated, and Center for Educational Measurement. They are also joined by distinguished assessment experts and practitioners from the academe. The Assessment PD program brings together grade 8 and 9 English, Science, and Mathematics teachers in public junior high schools nationwide. Running from October 2021 to April 2022, the Assessment PD program has 5 component courses. The first course, on Enhancement of Teachers' Assessment Competencies, introduces teachers to assessment competencies based on national and international standards. Assessment of Learning in DepEd intends to help teachers familiarize themselves on DepEd policies, standards, and programs pertaining to classroom, national, and international assessments. The third course is on the Philippine K-12 curriculum and the ILSA, which provides participants an opportunity to compare local and international fluency in reading, math, and science in order to understand emerging directions in teaching and assessment. Adapting assessment principles and practices to the emerging literacies provides participants with accessible tools, learning resources, and instructional strategies that will help them address literacy gaps identified by the PISA 2018 results. Lastly, the course on Monitored Application of Assessment Practice in the Classroom Setting is an avenue for synthesis and integration of learning through the practical demonstration of assessment competencies, principles, methods, and strategies. Filipino learners need to be equipped to face the increasingly complex challenges faced by the world today. Their preparation starts in the classroom, so we need to ensure that our teachers are given the tools and knowledge that they need to unlock their students' full potential. The Assessment PD is one step forward to this goal.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being with us today, even on a weekend. This shows how dedicated you are to continue learning and growing professionally. Magandang hapon, Julie.
Magandang hapon din sa iyo, X. Gayon din po sa lahat ng mga nakasubaybay sa atin ngayon. ACTRC is grateful and honored to be part of this DepEd initiative. Let's begin Module 1B synchronous session for math teachers.
And we will open the program with the Philippine National Anthem and a prayer.
Mga kababayan, ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas.
grasya mo upang kami mapagmahal. Dapat na tagapagpangalaga ng kalikasan. Maluwalhati ka, Panginoon.
الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. Ya Allah, kati ya Allah, papalad na miska ya Allah ya Rahman ya Rahim. Sa mga tawag ya wa ya Allah sikwagman ka ya Allah ya Rahman ya Rahim. Ya Allah bungi ya Allah sa mapya pamikiran ya Allah. Amo sarami ya Allah siku o kawapi ang siku kapagingad ya Allah pakangiginawa ya kami kay ya Allah pakapamagupa kami kay ya Allah. So kalangulawan o Pilipino ya Allah sisagi nga Pilipinas ya Allah. Napakanudurugo nga kaya sa mga mapya pamikiran ya Allah si ko kapagingad ya Allah na argang kar kami ya Allah Rahman ya Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin.
Maluwalhati ka, Panginoon. Dakila sa lahat, O Panginoon. Napakabuti mo, kailanman hindi ka nagbabago, Panginoon.
Thank you very much for your attention. My name is Julie de la Cruz, a research officer at the Assessment, Curriculum, and Technology Research Center, and I will be one of your hosts for today. ACTRC, as was introduced to you in Session 0, is a partnership between two universities, the University of the Philippines and the University of Melbourne. Right now, we are under the UP Center for Integrative and Development Studies in UP Diliman. With me is Xerxes De Castro, another research officer at ACTRC.
Thank you, Julie. Ako nga po si Xerxes, and on behalf of all the members of ACTRC and DepEd's Assessment Professional Development Secretariat, I'd like to welcome you all today to the first synchronous session for Module 1B-Math, Building Assessment Competence of Teachers. So today we will be talking about the first two sessions. You would remember Julie being with you in Session 1, Assessment Purposes, and yours truly in Session 2, Assessment Planning. Our main agenda this afternoon is to provide you a summary of the first two sessions, some highlights and important considerations, and to try to process your reflections from the initial batch of responses that we have gathered. So this will be coming from the reflection questions that we have asked you to answer right after accomplishing the Qualtrics forms.
Ang magiging informative ang session na ito, ano, X? But before we get to business, let us first acknowledge the people attending this session today. First in line, of course, are our dear junior high school math teachers from all over the country. From the initial data that we are getting, we know how far the first two training sessions have reached. And we expect that the number will continue to move up as we go along the entire Module 1B for math.
At syempre, Julie, nandyan din ang ating mga partner from DepEd, especially the DepEd Assessment PD Secretariat led by Ms. Maggie Del Valle, who we know have been very busy communicating with our dear teachers to address any of your concerns on the ongoing training. We would also like to take the opportunity to give our special thanks to Secretary Leonor Briones and Undersecretary Nepomuceno Malaluan, also for the National Educators Academy of the Philippines, the Australian Government Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the University of the Philippines Center for Integrative and Development Studies, and the University of the Philippines Integrated School.
To clear any of your confusions regarding the assessment purposes, our first speaker will be talking about the distinctions between them and discuss your responses to the reflection questions. While the speakers are delivering their presentations, you may type in your questions or comments in the comments box. They will be answered later in the session. Kaugnay nito ay hinihiling po namin mula sa inyo na kung maaari gamitin lamang natin ang comment section para sa inyong mga tanong o concerns. Ito ay upang masigurong lahat po ng mga tanong o concerns nyo ay makikita namin at hindi matatabunan ng ibang mga komento. Maraming salamat po sa inyong kooperasyon. Dumako na po tayo sa ating unang tagapagsalita. Our first speaker is Dr. Kevin Carl Santos, a Senior Research Fellow at the Assessment, Curriculum, and Technology Research Center. He is an Associate Professor at the Educational Research and Evaluation Area of the College of Education in the University of the Philippines, Diliman. He finished his PhD in Statistics in the same university in 2018. He was a visiting research scholar at the Graduate School of Education in Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey in 2015 and 2016, and a postdoctoral fellow in cognitive diagnosis modeling at the Faculty of Education, the University of Hong Kong in 2018 to 2019. His research interests include atom response theory, cognitive diagnosis modeling, and sampling the science and analysis of large-scale educational assessment data. Dear teachers, let's welcome Teacher Kevin to give the highlights of Session 1, Assessment Purposes.
Good afternoon, everyone. So, kahit po, salamat po sa pagsama sa amin sa unang synchronous session 1 for this module 1B, and hopefully you will learn more in our session. So for session 1, I will be discussing the summary. I'll be giving the summary and the highlights of assessment and its purposes. So if you can recall, in session 1, we talk about assessments and the two kinds of assessment based on the purpose of this assessment. But first, let us recall what an assessment is. So it's basically closely intertwined with what the curriculum is and the instruction. Okay, so that means that when we do assessment, dapat kasama dito kung ano yung nasasaad sa curriculum at kung ano yung tinuturo natin sa klase. So specifically, we define also what classroom assessment is based on DepEd Order number 8. So it's basically an ongoing process of identifying, gathering, organizing, and interpreting quantitative and qualitative information about what learners know and what they can do as well. In session 1, we talk about two types of assessment based on the purpose of the assessment. So we have what we call the formative assessment and summative assessment. So ano nga ulit ba yung formative assessment? So formative assessment refers to all activities undertaken by teachers and or by their students which provide information to be used as feedback to modify teaching and learning activities. So probably what I would like to emphasize regarding formative assessment is this can be, any method, assessment method. The important part of formative assessment is you will use the information that you will get from formative assessment to modify your teaching and learning activities. That is, you will adjust your classroom instruction or provide probably remediation measures to students who are in need. So that is basically the purpose of the assessment. That's why you are using a particular assessment method. Okay. Now, on the other hand, the other type of assessment is summative assessment. And typically, ito yung ginagawa natin. The summative purpose of assessment is to judge what the learner had achieved at the end of a course or a program. So, at the end of the quarter, for example, or probably at the end of a chapter, titingnan mo kung ano yung natutunan ng estudyante. It could be, let's say, at the end of the school year as well. So, ang primary goal mo naman dito or purpose mo naman when you have a summative assessment is to grade them, to judge what they have achieved at the end of the course or school year. Now, if you can still recall, ito yung table, this actually summarizes the differences between what formative assessment is and summative assessment. So for formative assessment, ito yung mga purposes or ito yung mga goals natin or aims natin. So if we have a particular assessment method and our goal natin is to identify the gap between the current and the desired learning competence, then that's formative assessment. If we would like to adapt for learner needs, kung ano man yung pangangailangan nila based on sa information na makukuha natin sa assessment natin, it also falls under formative assessment. If our goal is to provide feedback sa student, no? So kung tama ba yung ginawa nila, no? Based on makikita natin sa assessment. So it's still formative assessment. And aside from that, kung gusto mong improve yung instruction at engage yung students in the assessment and learning process, that also falls under formative assessment. On the other hand, kailan ba siya natatawag na summative assessment? So kung ang goal lang natin doon sa assessment natin is to grade the students, lalo na let's say kung gusto natin magkaroon ng kung ang goal natin is let's say to have a grade for the particular quarter, no? So let's say yung mga quarterly exam or periodical exam, so doon siya typically nagfo-fall sa summative assessment. For some, we also use that, for example, kung i-rank natin sila, yung mga estudyante, no? As well as, let's say, for reporting, for promotion sa next grade level, and also for certification. So, kung mapapansin nyo, for summative assessment, kung typically, ang gusto natin ay mag-grade sila, ma-rank sila, pero hindi natin ginagamit yung information na yon. For example, if we would like to improve our classroom instruction or to provide finer grained feedback, no? Diagnostic information kung ano yung kayang gawin at hindi kayang gawin ng mga estudyante. So yun yung primary goal kung summative assessment. Now, isa sa mga tanong probably ninyo at yung iba nagtanong na rin doon sa mga reflection log ay pwede bang yung assessment ay parehong formative at summative, no? It is possible, no? So this slide actually summarizes that, no? If you can recall from the asynchronous session. The same assessment instrument and indeed the same assessment outcomes can be used both summatively and formatively. So ibig sabihin, hindi lang nagtatapos sa pag-grade, no? So kung kunwari yung assessment na ginawa mo is solely for grading, then summative lang yung purpose niya. Pero kung gagamitin mo yung information na makukuha mo from that assessment tool or method to, let's say, adjust your classroom instruction, kung paano mo tinuturo isang lecture, at kung, let's say, to provide remediation classes, for example, or sessions sa mga estudyante mo, then ginagamit mo siya formatively din. Hindi lang siya for grading purposes. So in that case, pwedeng yung assessment method or tool mo or instrument, nagpo-fall siya under the two, no? Formative and summative. So sabi nga natin, summative assessment can also provide information that teachers can use to inform teaching and learning decisions for subsequent lessons. So it is important also that these assessment outcomes are constructively fed back to learners and with plans for improvement. So it's important though when we do, let's say, formative assessment, na mabigyan ng feedback yung estudyante para aware sila kung ano yung hindi pa nila kaya magawa at ano yung kayang-kaya na nilang gawin, no? And yung mga hindi nila kaya magawa, ano yung pwedeng gawin para ma-improve or ma-address yung mga pangangailangan pa nila. Okay? Now, in the asynchronous session 1, there's this table, no, we can recall na there are different assessment methods na pinakita that were given in that session. So, for example, yung PISA, classroom discussion, think, pair, share, student observation, listening to student conversation, for example, that's also already an assessment method, and as well as quiz. Tapos, makikita nyo sa second column, we have the specific purpose. Importante ito kasi this is how you can classify whether an assessment method or tool is formative or assessment. Babalikan nyo, if you, let's say, you provide a quiz or nag-administer kayo ng quiz, ano ba yung purpose ng quiz ninyo? Ang goal ba ng quiz nyo is to evaluate the performance para magkaroon kayo ng grade, for grading purposes lang siya? Or gagamitin mo ba siya, let's say, to adjust your classroom instruction? Or para mabigyan ng feedback yung mga estudyante kung ano yung kaya nilang gawin at hindi nila kayang gawin. So, nakabase sa specific purpose ng assessment method nyo, whether it is formative or summative. So, I think it's clearly stated also kung bakit ito yan, yung specific purposes, para maklasify siya doon sa dalawang purposes na yun. Okay? Now, some of the questions also in the reflection log, nagtatanong iba pang example, no, ng formative assessment. So, these are some formative assessment. Probably ginagawa nyo na siya before, pero baka hindi lang kayo aware na formative assessment na pala siya, no? So even in class discussion, let's say a simple recitation kung para malaman mo kung naintindihan ba ng student or hindi yung mga diniscuss mo, that's also formative assessment na. So other examples are clicker question, pwedeng group work, no, weekly quizzes, na ang main goal ng weekly quizzes ay hindi lang for grading but rather to improve kung ma-address mo kung ano pa yung hindi naiintindihan ng mga students. So your goal is to track learning and to improve classroom instruction. Now, for summative assessment, so typically quarterly exam, no, yung mga examples natin yan, or standardized test, lalo na kung meron, let's say, NAT or achievement test, so that's one example. But there are also some na katulad ng final project, final essay, final presentation, or final paper or report. Okay? So the goal is to evaluate student learning or to rank them at the end of the quarter, the semester, or the school year. Now, this table summarizes the differences between the two, the formative and summative assessment. So they differ in these three aspects: kung ano yung purpose ng assessment, kung yung occurrence in the teaching learning period, and then the role of the teacher. So as you can see, in terms of occurrence, yung formative assessment, it can happen anytime. Pero yung summative, typically, at the end of the period of learning unit pa siya, no? Whether at the end of the quarter, at the end of the school year. And I would like to highlight also yung role ng teacher dito sa formative, nagiging facilitator siya ng learning. Whereas sa summative assessment, assessor lang siya. Yun yung parang pinaka-role ng teacher dito. So here are also some examples that are provided, no. So for example, yung homework, I would probably just like to emphasize yung homework, no. Meron siyang specific purposes na naka-state dito. It is used to identify and address the learning gaps and basis for planning the next lesson. Tapos yung isa naman ay for grading. So this is an example na yung homework, gigradean mo siya. So for that purpose alone, summative siya. Pero gagamitin mo din siya to identify ano ba yung mga learning gaps ng mga students ko. And gagawin mo siyang basis sa pagpaplano mo kung paano mo gagawin yung classroom instruction mo sa susunod na lesson or sa susunod na linggo or quarter. So in that case, nagiging formative din siya. So this is an example that it's both formative and summative assessment. Okay. Now let's focus on formative assessment. No, we discussed that there are three processes involved in formative assessment. So we have gathering, interpreting, and acting on information about student learning. So may part na yun, no, nag-gather ka, in-interpret mo yung nag-gather mo information doon sa students, kung ano yung kaya nilang gawin, kung ano yung alam nila at hindi pa nila alam, and then you will act on it, no? So that is basically formative assessment. And we discussed two types of formative assessment, yung formal formative assessment and informal formative assessment. So for formal formative assessment, ang major na kaibahan talaga nila kasi formal, no? So it's a planned act. So it's designed to provide evidence about students learning. And it follows this process, no? So you gather, so ibig sabihin nagko-collect yung teacher na information at a planned time. So since planado mo na siya ahead of time, so let's say gumawa ka ng activity sheet na ibibigay mo sa student, no? Or probably a quiz or a homework, no? So it's planned that for the following session, bibigay ko to, and then pag binigay nila yung sagot nila, you will collect that information and you will act on that. So you know, pag-interpret and then you will act on that. So teacher will plan an action to help students achieve the learning goals. So ito yung process. So you gather, you interpret, and you act on it. Now, the second type of formative assessment is informal formative assessment. So as I've said kanina, baka probably you are already doing this, hindi nyo lang alam na it's already formative assessment, and probably it's what we call informal formative assessment. It is where evidence of learning is generated in the course of a teacher's day-to-day activities. So for example, no, ito yung proseso naman niya. So you elicit, you recognize, and you use. So for example, teacher brings out or develops information in the form of verbal response from students. So for example, pwede kayo mag-participation or pwede mag-ask kayo sa students during the class discussion, no? Kung alam nila yung isang particular concept, kung kaya nila sagutan itong math problem nito, for instance. And then, the teacher reacts on the fly by recognizing students' responses and comparing them to accepted scientific ideas. So by asking student questions during the classroom discussion, no, pwedeng doon, malaman nyo na, itong mga students na to, may mga nakakaintindi nitong concepts na to, pero meron ako mga students na may misconceptions pa. Meron silang hindi pa klaro na konsepto sa kanila sa math. So, ang gagawin mo doon ka na sa susunod, teacher immediately makes use of information from students during course of ongoing classroom narrative. So, pwedeng since doon na-recognize mo na may mga concepts silang hindi pa klaro or mali yung pagkaintindi ng students, no, based on the classroom discussion, ang gagawin mo naman medyo medyo impromptu na okay, so I can probably discuss this concept further so that yung misconception nila ma-address ko na as early as now before pa pumunta sa susunod na mas complicated na lecture. So that is the last part. So you will do that. So yan yung basically difference ng informal and formal formative assessment. So when you say assessment, hindi siya kumbaga laging nakakahon sa paper and pencil. It could be, katulad nga ng isang example na pinakita sa synchronous session na pwedeng observation lang o nakikinig ka lang kung paano nagdi-discuss yung mga students. It's still already an assessment method. Okay? So this is the ESRU model, no, for teacher elicit, tapos nagtatanong kayo, for example, then the student will respond, then teacher recognizes the student response, no? And then you will use that information, no? Kung paano mo i-adjust, for example, yung classroom instruction mo for that particular day, for instance. Now, to summarize, no, yung differences between formal and informal formative assessment, ito yung tatlong aspects kung saan sila nagkaiba. Timing of task. So, for formal, so planned nga siya, di ba? So, it's identified prior to the lesson proper. And then sa informal naman, typically spontaneous siya. Kaya yung example ko kanina, di ba? It could be a classroom discussion na nagpaparecite ka, for example, nagtatanong ka sa mga students, nalaman mo meron hindi klaro sa kanila. So, you do something about it that moment na, no? So, yun yung typically spontaneous. Yung timing of modification, kaugnay doon sa related to what I just said. Sa formal, since planned siya, you will analyze the information and you will act on it. Typically, after pa yan, no? Probably sa next meeting pa siya. Hindi siya doon sa mismong meeting kung saan mo na ginawa yung, let's say, planned na assessment method mo. Pero sa informal, on the spot yung adjustments to the lesson. So for example, let's say sa geometry, di ba may mga proving, nakita mo na merong mga students na nahihirapan sa pagpo-prove. So, ano kaya yung problem, no? You can identify that from the responses of the students, and then during that time din, pwedeng magbigay ka ng another example kasi nalaman mo saan ba sila nalilito, saan ba hindi klaro sa kanila. So you will give a more examples probably to further illustrate kung paano yung proseso ng pagpo-prove sa geometry. And then lastly, yung level and structure also, they differ. So for formal, it's a planned structure, no? Pero yung informal, student-teacher conversation level, and it gives just-in-time feedback. So here are some other examples. No? So yung pinakita sa asynchronous session. So in the reflection log also, I noticed that some questions are asking for more examples. Pero I guess when we cannot probably exhaust all the possible examples, but probably to highlight, no, yung example na binigay sa asynchronous session, you have we have the quiz B, no? So yung quiz B, hindi siya graded, no? Pero hindi rin siya formal. Kasi it could be, it will be used to make immediate instructional decisions. Gagamitin mo rin doon. So palalaman mo kung ano yung kaya ng sagutin, ano yung alam ng student, at ano pa yung hindi kayang alam, or hindi pa kayang gawin, or hindi pa alam ng student. And from there, pwede mong i-adjust na kung ano yung i-discuss mo that day, no? That particular thing. Ganun din sa classroom discussion. That's why these two, they fall under informal. Pero yung, as well as yung huli, which is the student observation, which is you just listen to the student conversation. Yung formal naman, so activity sheet, so planado, meron ka gumawa ka talaga ng activity sheet and they are collected at a planned time. Tapos yung sagot nila doon, i-analyze mo, ano ba yung kayang gawin at hindi pa kayang gawin ng mga students, and gagamitin mo yung information na yun para planuhin ano yung gagawin ko sa susunod na class meeting natin. So that is classified as a formal formative assessment. So these are other examples, no? So informal formative assessment, pwedeng gumamit ka, let's say, ng printed emoji scales, or even, let's say, thumbs up, thumbs down. Kung kunwari, meron kang binigay na problem at let's say you ask them if they agree if tama yung solution or hindi, that's already an informal formative assessment. So it could be, let's say, graphic organizers or conversations as well. Tapos yung formal, pwede yung seatwork kasi pinagplanuhan mo yan, no? Yung seatwork at quizzes. Yun yung formal, and then hindi impromptu or hindi spontaneous yung pag-adjust mo sa classroom instruction. Okay? So, what to look forward, no, sa di-discuss natin for Module 1B, no? So, for the next sessions, you will talk about assessment planning, evidence collection, interpretation of assessment evidence, use of assessment interpretation, and lastly, yung pag-evaluate ng assessment process na ginagawa nyo to inform continuous improvement cycles. So, what are the key takeaways for this session? So, let me just emphasize this, no? So, first, assessment plays a vital role both in teaching and in learning. So, it helps diagnose student progress towards learning goals and inform instructional decision. Assessment evidence can also be used for formative and summative purposes or both. So, we talk about yung cases kung kailan pa pwede mong gamitin for formative and summative purposes siya. And then next, yung formative assessment, it could be formal or informal, and they differ in 3 aspects. So yung timing ng task, yung timing ng modification, as well as yung level and structure. And lastly, we would like to emphasize that assessment is an ongoing process that involves planning, evidence collection, interpretation of assessment evidence, and use of assessment interpretation and evaluation of assessment process to inform continuous improvement cycles. Okay, so that summarizes session 1. Now, these are the selected questions that we obtained from the reflection logs, and I'll try to answer most of them. No, so first, can we ask recommendations on how can we monitor students' learning or progress in modular distance learning? So even in the science sessions, no, this is a common question, and it's very challenging, especially kung modular distance learning siya, no. One of the things that you can also do is you may use kung available, no, you may use, for example, yung, let's say, Facebook chat or Messenger, kung merong mga gadgets yung mga students, you can ask them questions there to do, let's say, formative assessment. Pero pwede kasing Q&A lang yun, no? So itatanungin mo yung estudyante, no? And based sa mga sagot ng estudyante, you will try to understand kung ano ba yung kaya na niyang gawin at yung malabo pa sa kanya. So it's one possible scenario. Another thing na possible is kung kunwari pwede mo siyang tawagan if you have, let's say, resources, let's say cellphone, at may cellphone din yung mga estudyante, pwedeng ala interview session yung gagawin mo sa student so that malalaman mo kung ano na yung progress ng students based doon sa lecture na ginagawa mo. So I think those are some of the things that you can work on also. And we acknowledge, of course, na mahirap, lalo na kung hindi available yung mga resources katulad ng cellphone, no, or even internet or mobile data. Now, the next question is, proving exercises in mathematics grade 8 is one of the most challenging lessons to teach. May I ask for advice on what assessment method, specifically for formative assessment, would I use? So, proving actually in general, whether it's in grade 8 or in other grade levels, is actually difficult to teach. It's a skill that is learned through time, no? So, for example, kung I think the context here is in geometry. Ang pwedeng, kunwari, kung face-to-face or let's say possible yung synchronous session or pwedeng yung tawagan yung student, you can do like a think aloud protocol, no? You can ask the students to verbalize their thoughts kung paano yung proseso ng pag-iisip nila, and you can guide them, no? You can support them while proving a particular theorem or a particular result in geometry. So ako, kung kunwari sa klase, kung face-to-face to, or even sa synchronous sessions, ginagawa ko pag nagpapaprove ako sa students before, I'll ask them to show the proof, and then I'll ask them to explain it, and then ginaguide ko siya. So, for example, bakit ka pumunta sa step 2, paano ka nakapunta sa step 3 from step 2? So, I'll let them explain, and then based on their answer, titingnan ko kung may tama, kung may mali doon sa sinasabi nila, at kung may mali, doon ko kino-correct na sa point na yon kung paano makorek yung flow ng proof na yun. So it's as I've said, proving is a skill, no? It's typically earned through time, no? Hindi siya mahirap siya talagang ituro, no? So it takes a lot of practice sa part ng students. And then next question is, can a group activity be considered a summative assessment if it is graded? So babalik tayo doon sa reason kung kailan nagiging summative or formative yung assessment. It depends on the purpose. So kung ang purpose ng assessment is to grade them, no? And you will not use that kung ano man yung ginawa ng group activity na yun to, let's say, give feedback sa students, to address their learning gaps, or to adjust your classroom instruction, hindi siya mako-consider as formative assessment. So kung purely for grading lang yung purpose niya, it's considered a summative assessment. And then, I want to ask more sample scenarios on how the summative assessment becomes formative assessment and vice versa. So, I think I already emphasized this, no? Pwede ko i-emphasize ko lang ulit na babalik kayo. So, I think the very important thing that you have to remember is, or to ask yourself is, what is the purpose of my assessment? Why am I doing this assessment? So, kung ang goal mo, let's say, is just for reporting, for ranking the students, or for grading, then summative lang siya, no? And then, pero kung gagamitin mo siya at the same time, for example, to adjust your classroom instruction, okay, so yung to support student learning and so on, or to track student, monitor student progress, then nagiging formative na siya. So, balikan nyo kung ano yung purpose nyo sa assessment, and that will give you the answer kung for summative or formative siya, or both yung assessment na yun. Okay, so I think because of limited time, I will only answer this 4 questions from the reflection lab. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teacher Kevin, for that very clear and informative review of assessment purposes. Kumusta po mga teacher? We hope that your learning on this topic was further strengthened by that presentation. Julie, I think we're ready to move to the next part, which is the review of assessment planning. And to help us better understand this topic, we have with us our next speaker for today, Dr. Marlene Ferido. Dr. Marlene B. Ferido is presently the Philippine Deputy Director of ACTRC, and she has been with ACTRC since its inception in 2013. Some of her involvements in the center include the research on the progress of students through science curriculum, review of the Philippine K-12 curriculum, feasibility study on micro-certification for the alternative learning system in the Philippines, and technical support in the review of DepEd's reports on international large-scale assessments such as PISA 2018 and TIMSS 2019. Dr. Ferido holds a bachelor's degree in chemistry from UP Diliman and an MS Agricultural Chemistry degree from UP Los Baños. She completed her PhD in science education with a specialization in chemistry from UP Diliman. She was a chemistry instructor at the Department of Chemistry in UP Los Baños and subsequently an assistant professor at the Institute of Chemistry in UP Diliman. Dr. Ferido is a retired science education specialist and former chair of the chemistry group of the UP National Institute for Science and Mathematics Education Development, or UP-NISMED. She served as its deputy director for research and extension and later as deputy director for administration. And she was also a researcher and project leader in various science education projects of UP-NISMED. Teachers, let's welcome Dr. Marlene Ferido.
Okay. I'd like to share with you a review of your second session on assessment planning. We have here the diagram, which I highly recommend that you remember all throughout the PD. For the assessment process, The planning is the first step for formative assessment and is followed by a cycle. And if you look at the diagram, the cycle is composed of the processes that you undergo when you teach and the students learn. These are collecting evidence and then interpreting it and then using the evidence. After the formative assessment cycle, then you evaluate the process. Now, the assessment process for the summative assessment is similar, but the middle portion of the diagram is not the same. You begin with planning, but then if you look at the diagram, you also collect, interpret evidence, but the use of the evidence is for another purpose, and that is to grade and report the achievement of your students. So this process also ends with evaluation, just like what you have for formative assessment. Again, I recommend that in your mind, as you go through this module 1B, visualize these two diagrams for you to fully grasp the differences between formative and summative assessment. All right. Now, why is planning so important? Well, first, it will improve your teaching and learning. Secondly, it will lay out to you the learning goals based on the curriculum, the context in which you are in and the students are in, the needs of the learners, and the available resources that both you and the students have. It will also guide you in assessing the progress of the learners. Now, going back to the diagram of formative assessment, since it is a cycle in the teaching learning process, the cycle can be short, which could be minute by minute, or it could be day after day. It can be medium length, which will be between units of topics or lessons, or it can be a long cycle between quarters, say between the first and the second quarter, etc. So in the following sessions, in the following weeks, you will learn about how to implement these different cycles of formative assessment. Now, but when you plan, we're still in the planning stage, there are important factors to consider. First, of course, you look at your mathematics curriculum guide, where you find the curriculum standards, and these are the content standards and the performance standards. Secondly, you have to consider the curriculum connections, meaning how does math connect with science, with English, with social studies, etc. And the connections also between grade levels. How does my grade 8 lesson on geometry connect with the previous grade level or the succeeding grade levels? So this is a very important factor in planning assessment. Third factor is the progression of learning. Ano ba ito? These are the increasing levels of difficulty and complexity when the students acquire mathematical knowledge, skills, and attitudes within a topic or a domain in math. Okay. Now, an example. When we consider the curriculum standards, of course, your lesson or the teaching event at a certain point in your semester or in your quarter, the assessments should be aligned with the curriculum, specifically to the content and performance standards and learning competencies. You have to look at all the three, of course, using your mathematics curriculum guide. this is indispensable. Okay, for example, the content standard says that the student should demonstrate understanding of triangle congruence. Okay. The learning competencies stated or indicated in the curriculum guide are the following: illustrates triangle congruence, illustrates the SAS or the side angle side, ASA angle side angle, and SSS side congruence postulates. Thirdly, students need to solve corresponding parts of congruent triangles, say finding the length of the side or how much is the angle, etc. And lastly, prove two triangles are congruent. Okay, so those are in the learning competencies in the math curriculum guide. Now, when you consider those, you need to consider also the curriculum connections. Okay? Meaning, you plan your assessment considering the interrelationships of concepts and competencies between and among learning areas and grade levels. Now, I saw some reflection questions related to how do I motivate my students to learn math, etc., and similar reflections. Now, I believe that motivation could be part or the solution to motivate your students is to show them the meaning of the connections of the concepts that you are teaching. For example, kung babalikan natin yung learning competency, sabi doon, congruence, di ba? Triangle, demonstrate understanding of triangle congruence. All right. Siyempre, alam nila dapat kung ano ang triangle. At alam nila ang ibig sabihin ng congruence. Now, you cannot just define congruence mathematically or geometrically. You've got to start with the context or the importance of congruence. Congruence is a very important mathematical idea to understand the structure of our environment, right? This may not be in your curriculum guide or in your learning competency, but an appreciation of congruence is very important for them to understand triangle congruence. Now, congruence is seen in nature, in the human body, in architecture, structures such as roads and bridges, in the toy kite, diba? Or triangle congruence in the chocolate Toblerone. Now, if students appreciate what is congruence, meaning similarity in size and shape in terms of sides and angles, then they will start to be motivated on learning about triangle congruence. And after that, then they can apply the concepts and skills related to triangle congruence to solve related problems in other areas of math, like in algebra, measurements, and trigonometry. Okay. So it is very important to start with connections many times. As a teacher, I find that very important. Progression of learning is another important factor. This describes the increasing, tingnan nyo ha, increasing level of difficulty and complexity that students encounter when they acquire the knowledge, skills, and attitudes within a math domain or topic. All right? Tingnan nyo, look at this progression of learning from the bottom. From number 1, because that is the least difficult in terms of the topic triangle congruence. So the first level is defines congruence between plane figures in general and triangles in particular. So sabi ng teacher dyan sa example na yan, magsimula ka sa plane figures, yung walang thickness. Could be a line, you know, hindi three-dimensional. And then go to triangles also in particular. But as I have said, of course, you have to show the meaning of congruence as it is applied in real life, so that they will appreciate bakit ko ba kailangan maintindihan itong congruence ng triangles, right? The second level of difficulty is identifying corresponding parts of congruent triangles and name the congruent triangle given the corresponding congruent parts. Ibig sabihin, congruent ba yung size? Yung side. Congruent ba yung angles? Okay, so you have to guide the students in going from level 1, kung nakita na nila kung anong ibig sabihin ng congruence, similarity in size and in shape, in length, ganyan, kasi side ng triangle, then they have to identify the parts which are congruent. And then, third level of difficulty, they need to know how to give the necessary condition that must be satisfied to show congruence between two triangles using the postulates. In other words, ano ba ang basehan kung kailan pwedeng sabihin na itong dalawang triangles na to ay congruent? Now, they need to use postulates. That's why this is a higher level of knowledge. But they can do this if they fully understand levels 1 and 2. Okay? Now, the problem is in the classroom, sometimes the teacher goes so fast that she starts explaining at level number 3 without fully appreciating and understanding, the student, what congruence is. And then the highest level is proving, ito na, no? Ipo-prove mo na itong triangle na to, triangle ABC, is congruent to triangle DEF by the postulates of the side, angle, angle, and side postulates. All right. So that's the progression of learning that you need to consider whenever you plan assessment. Sabihin nyo, ang tagal naman. Ang dami kong i-consider. Yes, madami, but it is very important that we look at all of this. Isa pa, timing. When is the best time to give the assessment? Siyempre, nakapagturo na kayo, and you have given examples of different levels of difficulty. And you have also given formative assessment as you went along. Now is the timing. You have again, as Kevin Carl said, you have to consider the purpose of your assessment in order to consider the timing. Kapag formative, syempre, it could be at that moment, could be the next day, could be within the week, etc. Or it could be an end of topic assessment which is summative. Now, the fifth factor is context and resources. What are the needs and backgrounds of learners? Ito na, maraming tanong tungkol sa modular learning. Ano bang meron ng estudyante? Ano bang background nila? Ano ba yung setting nila sa bahay? What are the resources available for the teacher, for you teachers, and for the learners? So kung alam yan, then you can plan well. You cannot plan where only a few students have their own computer or gadget, tablet or cell phone. Okay, now, why are you planning? Nasabi na natin yung importance, pero you have to plan also how to use the data, the evidence that you have collected. You have to use it for giving feedback, for informing your decisions, like, naintindihan na ba kaya ng mga bata kung ano talaga ang triangle congruence? Now, if not, then based on your assessment data, then you have to give 1 or 2 more examples. Then you should plan how to use the evidence or data you collected to plan for the next steps. Ano na yung mga susunod? Kasi meron naman kayong plan of work. And then you can report the progress to whoever requires that information. Okay. Now, as you plan, aside from the 5 factors, you have to consider these questions. Unang-una, gagaya rin sa session 1, what is the purpose of doing the assessment? Okay. Number 2, what competencies do you wish to assess? So anong titingnan mo dyan? Titingnan mo syempre yung learning competencies base dun sa curriculum guide. Thirdly, which strategy would best give learners the opportunity to demonstrate what they have learned? This is quite challenging. There's a question like, I'll answer na lang that later on. Pero this requires planning on your end. You cannot just plan for those in level 1 in terms of progression of learning, but you have to also plan for those in 2, 3, and if you think there may be those in level 4, then give examples or plan for it too. Okay, another question. Which strategy would most likely gather evidence of learners' progress given the time allotment? O eto, timing. Diba? Isang factor. Given the time allotment, alin ang makakakuha ng maraming ebidensya nung progress ng mga estudyante nyo? Okay. Now, sabihin nyo, ang dami kong estudyante. Then you can always group your students according to their levels in the learning progression. And then number 5, will the assessments be given per student or in groups? Diba natakal na rin yan kanina sa session 1. Siyempre, mas madali kadalasan if it's in group. Okay, but there is always a need to give assessments individually. Number 6 question. Which strategy would work best in eliciting information from learners? O, yung assessment mo ba, yung question mo ba, talagang makakahugot ng information para malaman mo kung ano na nga ba ang naintindihan ng estudyante. Or ano pa ang hindi nila masyadong maintindihan. Or hindi nila talaga maintindihan. Okay? Next question, number 7. What resources are available to both learners and teachers? Okay? Ano nga ba meron? Reference book? Internet access? Find out. Okay? There should always be equity and fairness, no, in terms of resources. Okay, number 8. What kind of data will be useful for giving feedback? Oh, ito bang evidence or data? Assessment data ay pwedeng gamitin magbigay ng feedback sa estudyante ko. Sasabihin nyo, okay class, may mga estudyante or group dito na ito ang kanilang pananaw sa triangle congruence. Tingnan natin kung paano pa natin mabibigyan ng marami pang example. Okay. Pero you have used evidence that was indicated or given based on your assessment. All right. And therefore, whatever data you collect, that will inform your future decisions your next steps, and reporting progress. Okay. There were many questions which were related to each other. So I will just answer those which are, I think, will be helpful in reinforcing this session on assessment planning. Yung isang tanong, is it really necessary that all factors, di ba 5 yung factors, is it really necessary that all factors need to be considered in planning an assessment? Okay. Medyo kailangan pag-isipan yung sagot. Ano? Kailangan mo ba lahat tingnan yung factors na yon, yung 5? Okay. I don't need to go back, pero titingnan ko lang. Yan. Well, my answer for that is it is very advantageous to consider in planning all the factors. Unang-una, yung curriculum standards, hindi nyo pwede yung hindi i-consider. That, because that's the guide. Nandiyan yung learning competencies, no? Even the progression of learnings, kailangan yon kasi that will show you the limitations or the extent of student understanding. Timing din, kailangan. Kung konti na lang oras mo or sobrang dami pa. Okay? And context and resources. Inalam mo na ba? Kasi yung context and resources, once na nalaman mo na yan at the beginning, you already know that in the succeeding weeks and months and quarters. Okay. Now, these factors will be signposts for you to determine what strategy will be best so that the learners will demonstrate what they know, what they can do in math, okay, what they have learned. So, it is advantageous. Bukod doon sa diagram na dalawa na sabi ko, visualize it. Magandang isulat niyo yung 5 factors at tuwing magpaplano kayo ng assessment nyo, ay tingnan nyo yan. Okay. Another interesting question, and hindi lang isa ang nagtanong. Okay. Is curriculum connection an integral part in planning assessment? Okay. Yung subsequent question or related, we need to understand more of these curriculum connections, its relevance in planning for assessment. Okay. I think I spent more time on this than the other factors. Yes, curriculum connections are an integral part in planning assessment. Ultimately, this is where the learners will understand, find meaning, appreciate the depth and the extent of what they are learning in geometry. Right? Because they will see how concepts or skills are used and applied. And this is where mathematical concepts also find meaning in real life. If you have seen release items of PISA in mathematical literacy, they are all embedded in real life contexts. That is why if there's any factor that you need to consider seriously, it is the curriculum connections. How is congruence exhibited in biology, in nature, in the human body? How is it exhibited in structures? Dyan, sa physics naman yan. How is congruence exhibited in language? In Filipino, meron yon. Okay? So, I consider it an integral part in planning. Okay, I hope that answers your question and gives you some challenge to consider it. Another question. It says, it is given that students are different. Some are slow learners, some are fast learners. Tanong, is it advisable to give the same assessment for this types of students? Meaning yung sinasabi mong magkaibang estudyante. First, payong kapatid, payong teacher. We need to refrain from labeling our students as slow or fast learners. I believe that learners are differently abled, but all learners can learn if there is sufficient guidance and intervention. But if you think that a student has some special needs with respect to learning in general, then it might be good to refer that student to your SPED department. All right. Now, going back sa tanong, is it advisable to give the same assessments for what this teacher calls slow learner and fast learner? Now, if you're thinking about formative assessment here, and you want to collect evidence as to where your students are in the progression of learning a concept, then you should have different assessments first. Okay, formative assessment. Determine first where they are in terms of learning the concept or skill. You don't need to grade them first. You can also give a formal or an informal formative assessment to similar students naman in terms of their level in the progression on a particular concept. So, meron kayong magkaiba kapag magkaiba sila sa progression of learner at magkapareho kung andun sila sa same level. So, but it will be good if you have students who are in the higher levels to give them challenging formative assessments also. Okay, so you know where they are. Okay. I think the other questions, the other question on, can I adopt 2 or more formative and summative assessments targeting only one major competency for all learners of varying cognitive skills? I've answered that in the previous question, okay? And then, well, one or two questions I think will be best answered by your guidelines in your division or some DepEd orders in terms of the integrity of assessments that you have in your modules. Okay. So I think that is all for the Q&A that I have, and this concludes my time with you. Thank you.
Julie, I think you muted ka.
Nakamute po pala ako, pasensya na. So thank you, Ma'am Marlene, for the enlightening presentation. We hope that the presentation has clarified your concerns and motivated you to develop your assessment practice further. Our resource speakers are ready to answer your questions. So if you have any questions or clarifications regarding assessment purposes and assessment planning, please free to type them in the comments box. Xerxes?
Right. Thank you po, Ma'am Julie. So, mga teacher, kung meron po kayong questions, please feel free po to type them in the comments box. So, right now, we're not really having questions, just only ones, I think relevant to the topic today. So I'll read the question, and habang sinasagot po ito ng ating resource speakers, maaari pa rin po kayong magbigay or maglagay ng inyong mga tanong sa ating comments box. So let me read the question po for our resource speaker. This is question 1. So how can we apply the use of assessment plan in modular distance learning?
Ako ata ang dapat sasagot nun, ano?
Yes po, Ma'am Marlene.
Pakiulit nga. Sinulat ko yung simula.
Yes po. How can we apply? Yes po. How can we apply the use of assessment plan in modular distance learning?
All right. Well, I'm not very familiar with how often the modules are given, but I'm sure that the teachers get the modules much ahead of time than the students, di ba? Now, I also assume that there are already assessment tasks within the module. Now, but of course, the teacher can, kung natanggap nyo na kaagad-agad yung modules nyo, say for 1 month, or for 1 or 2 big chunks of topics, then it's much easier to plan because you don't really need to stick to the questions in the assessment in the module, meaning hindi lang yon. You can use it but add on it. And then look at the span or the range of assessment within 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 modules. So mapaplano nyo kaagad, syempre yung nandun sa module, unang-una kinonsider na yung curriculum standards. Definitely, I suppose. Kasi hindi ako nakakita ng module sa math, kaya I'm trying to imagine. Tapos, meron timing yan, di ba? Tapos, yung content and resources, you already know the resources available to their students. So, hindi naman kayo magpapagawa ng, mag-search kayo ng ganito-ganito kung karamihan walang access sa internet. But then, at the beginning modules, makukuha nyo rin, if you prepare a progression of learning of the topics within that module or in the related module, then you can already have a progression and then you can add to the assessment tasks and questions in the module. I don't think that is prohibited. Okay? I think that will enrich the lessons. Tapos, tingnan nyo din kung alin ba dito ang pwedeng ang formative. Kasi naka-label naman siguro doon formative, no? Pero posible rin. Pwede nyo gamitin for another purpose, which is summative. So, papag-aralan nyo at titingnan nyo. I think the mindset that, this is a module, I really have to work within this, and yun lang, I think that is not encouraged. You can add assessment tasks to enrich the assessment questions in the module. So tingnan nyo na kaagad yung maraming modules na nasa kamay nyo para mapaplano nyo niya kung halimbawa kulang yung oras nyo dito sa module 1. Di mag-a-adjust kayo kung sa tingin nyo yung module 2 naman ay kayang mas-squeeze in dun sa time. So what is important is really to understand also the students and how they learn the concepts. But it's so important in math that they've got a hold of the prerequisite concepts. Alam nyo, halimbawa grade 8, sigurado ba kayo yung estudyante nyo na intindihan yung triangle? I mean, it's not a put down on them, pero make sure every term that you use is understood by your students. So, paplanuhin nyo rin yan doon sa inyong, kahit na nandyan yung module. Siyempre, parang yung module, di ba, script, i-deliver mo yon in a way that is needed by your audience. Who are your students? Okay, I think yun lang ang pwede kong sabihin.
Thank you, Ma'am Marlene. So I agree po. I think it's a very good starting point to really think and appreciate that as teachers, tayo po yung mas nakakaalam kung where our learners are, what they can do. And looking at the modules, hindi lang natin siya basta may ibigay sa mga bata, kundi really have to review them, see if it fits their current capabilities and what we can do to try to tweak it a bit to make sure that we are measuring what we intend to measure and make sure that we are able to deliver what we have to deliver in class. Thank you po. Julie, would you like to read question 2?
Yes, Cersei. So here's another question po. Is diagnostic or aptitude test can be used as assessment to determine learners' outcome?
Kay Sir Kevin yan, Teacher Kevin.
Okay, so regarding sa question, so I probably himayin natin yung question kasi dalawang type of test yan, no? So the first one is the diagnostic test and the other one is the aptitude test. So for unahin ko muna siguro yung aptitude test because if you will see the definition of the aptitude test, no, its main goal is to assess the general mental ability or logical reasoning skills of a particular individual. So hindi siya kumbaga nakadikit sa curriculum, no? Kumbaga hindi yun yung purpose niya. So for aptitude test, probably it's not it cannot be used to assess learning outcome kasi mas general yung tinitingnan niya. Now, kung diagnostic test naman, the term is diagnostic, no? So it aims to diagnose. So balikan mo kung paano ginawa, construct yung exam. So kung yung exam na yun ay it's meant to diagnose whether yung mga learning outcomes, no, ay na-master na ba or hindi na-master ng mga students, then definitely it can be used for for assessing the learning outcomes of the students.
Thank you, Sir Kevin. So, Julie, mukhang talaga importante na babalik tayo sa purpose ng assessment. So, yung mga tanong natin as a teacher, kung ano ba yung dapat natin gawin in the class, how should we assess, we always go back to the purpose, what we intend to really bring about in the class. So, let me read question 3. How to assure that the results of summative assessments are valid and reliable in printed modular distance learning modality? Or related question, how will we measure the reliability of our formative assessment in modular distance learning? So ang question po ito ay, how do we ensure reliability of our formative and summative assessments? Kumbaga, kung i-merge po natin yung dalawang questions. So how do we ensure validity, reliability of formative and summative assessments in printed modular distance learning modalities?
So I'll try to answer, but Marlene,
Sige na, ikaw, Kevin.
feel free to add something po. So I think regarding this, no, it's very hard to ensure that I think yung pinanggagalingan nito kasi is yung sino ba yung nagsasagot ng module, kung modular yung format or mode, no? Kasi marami even sa reflection logs, no, yun yung isa sa mga sinasabi or tanong na paano mo ma-ensure na reliable or valid yung assessment mo kung bakang nagsasagot ay yung parents or students. So I think ang ano lang yung pwede nating gawin, no, to ensure na natututo yung student. So you can, as mentioned by Ma'am Marlene earlier, hindi tayo nakakahon doon sa kung ano yung mga, let's say, assessments na nakalagay doon sa module natin. So for example, if the resources are available, what we can do is we can also check our students personally. So as I've said earlier, pwede nyo, let's say, tawagan. And to ensure kung kunwari, nakita mo puro nasagutan lahat yung nasa module, no, you can do a quick check, no, so to verify if the students really understand or tama talaga na nakakasunod siya sa lesson, no. So you can, let's say, sa chat, sa Facebook Messenger, or you can even call them. Or pwedeng gawin nyo, mag-provide kayo ng iba pang mga assessment methods or exercises to determine kung nakakasunod. Hindi lang kumbaga yung nakalagay doon sa module natin. And again, emphasis lang natin, when you say formative assessment, hindi siya laging nakakahon sa written, no? So it can be, kaya ako sinasabi kanina, pwedeng, for example, kung asynchronous pa rin siya module, what you can do is to tawagan sila, Pwedeng, for example, sa Facebook Messenger, i-chat sila, no? So you can add more methods to ensure na na natututo sila or hindi ba doon kahit nasasagutan nila kumbaga yung yung mga exercises sa module.
Thank you, Sir Kevin. Ma'am Marlene, may gusto po ba kayong idagdag?
Agree ako doon. Tapos, kung kaya naman ng teacher na meron siyang, kasi di ba kinukuha on a regular basis yung module ng mga estudyante. So, kasi nagplano na siya, nakita na ng teacher yung halimbawa modules 1 to 4. Nag-i-imagine lang ako kung ilan. Kung nakita na niya yon, so pwede na yung susunod na module na kukunin ng mga bata, baka meron namang budget yung school or yung teacher na mag-insert ng halimbawa isang page or isang 1/2 sheet of paper sa bawat module na kukunin ng mga bata, which you think may be a good formative assessment or maybe a good activity, a short activity, just for them to reach to the next level of in terms of progression of learning. Na posible din yon. Basta kaya ng budget, diba?
Thank you po, ma'am. Thank you, Sir Kevin. So, babasahin ko na yung next question, Sir Xis. Actually, this question po, so masasagot po siya, may encounter niyo yung sagot dito sa susunod na sessions, particularly session 4 and 5. So, babasahin ko na lang din po para at least ay may idea tayo kung ano yung may encounter niyo pa in the next session. So, here's the question. When giving feedback, how do we make corrections without discouraging the students? So, it's about feedbacking na, Sir Xis.
Sige, so let's keep them hanging muna, Julie, para ma-excite silang i-take ang ating session 4 and 5. So let me read the final question for this session. So where does group performance task belong? Is it formative or summative assessment? Ulitin ko po, where does group performance task belong? Is it informative or summative assessment?
Ibabalik ko yung tanong sa kanya. Ano ba yung purpose? Ganun naman, di ba? That's what I said earlier, no? To emphasize yung difference ng summative and formative assessment. What is your purpose? Why are you asking the students to do group performance tasks? So kung ang goal mo dyan, let's say, para yung isang final requirement nila, no? Sa course nila or sa subject nyo, probably it's just for grading. And therefore, kung for grading siya, magpo-fall lang siya sa summative assessment. Pero kung yung group performance task, yung makukuha mong information doon, whether yung makikita mo kung meron bang hindi nakakasunod or hindi nakakagawa ng performance task na yon, at gagamitan mo yon to address that, tutulungan mo let's say mga students or gagawa ka ng another let's say lecture or parang i-guide yung students further para makasunod or magawa yung performance task, then doon siya magpo-fall sa formative assessment. So, babalik tayo sa tanong ko, ano ba yung purpose nung group performance task? And that will answer your question whether formative or summative assessment.
Thank you, Teacher Kevin. Ma'am Marlene, anything to add po or are you happy with the answer?
I'm happy with the answer. I think as we go along, the teachers will really focus more on the purpose of assessment rather than just think about formative and summative.
Summative. Thank you po, ma'am. And siguro remind lang din po natin yung participants na ang isang assessment task or activity can either be formative or summative. So hindi lang siya basta formative or summative, kundi pwede din siyang pareho. And I hope that's clear right now. So maraming salamat po, Ma'am Marlene and Teacher Kevin for answering the questions. And thank you also to our teachers for participating actively and raising your questions. And as mentioned po, there will be other sessions after this, which I think would still spark your questions and so on. So at this point po, we would like to request the two speakers to provide a summary or synthesis of the synchronous session. Any last message, comments, reminders po sa ating mga teacher?
I would probably say na hopefully itong first synchronous session will keep you going, no? So ang focus natin dito ay you should learn matutuhan yung una yung pag-identify ng purpose ng assessment and the entire assessment process that will be discussed ng mga succeeding sessions. So hopefully your interest will be there until the end.
Thank you po, Ma'am Marlene.
Yeah, I just wanted to conclude by saying that assessment planning involves many strategies in terms of the length of the cycles to improve the teaching and learning process. So hawak talaga, nasa kamay ng teacher yung success ng mga estudyante in terms of learning outcomes. And in planning, your decisions will always consider the factors that we discuss, the curriculum standards, the curriculum connections, the progression of learning, timing, and content and resources. All right. All the best in your assessment planning.
Thank you, Ma'am Marlene and Teacher Kevin. Now, I think it's a good time to address some administrative issues from our participants, Xerxes. We've been monitoring the Facebook group, Assessment PD participants, to find out any concerns that you may be having right now, especially on the use of the learning platform Qualtrics. Ideally, use personal computers so you can view the lecture videos and complete the activities more efficiently. A good internet connection is also required. You can still use your tablet or mobile phone, but make sure to have a stable internet connection. Most of the issues experienced are addressed by these two conditions. We found out that there are common concerns about these, and here's how we can address them. Kung hindi nyo po ma-access ang links, please check your internet connection or use a different browser. If you are getting an error message while inputting any details like password and email address, please make sure to input the correct information, check internet connection, or use a different browser. Paki-try nyo rin pong i-refresh ang inyong browser or gumamit ng ibang device. Kung hindi naman po nag-replay ang lecture videos, please check your internet connection or use a different browser. And if any of your responses are not being accepted, please try addressing the error message or refreshing your browser. Again, madalas po ay device o internet connection related ang dahilan ng technical issues na inyong nararanasan. Kung kailangan niyo po ng tulong, please send a message to the Assessment PD Participants Facebook group.
Salamat, Julie. Our participants may also have some concerns about the use of LMS. Minsan hindi nila ito ma-access, so may delay ang pagtanggap nila ng information. So para po sa mga administrative issue other than the content of training and Qualtrics, the DepEd Secretariat will handle them through separate channels. So pakihintay na lamang po ang kanilang announcement tungkol dito at palagi niyo pong bisitahin ang Facebook group na Assessment PD Participants para nga po sa mga announcement. But before we close, here are some reminders for our next sessions. Session 3, Evidence Collection, will be available on Monday, December 6. Session 4, Interpretation and Use of Student Data, will be available or will start to be accessible on Wednesday, December 8. And for those who have not answered or completed sessions 1 and 2, you may still proceed with the training, but note that we highly encourage you to take the sessions in order. That is from session 1 first, going to session 2 next, up to session 6, to maximize your possibilities for learning. Ang ating pong susunod na synchronous session ay sa susunod na Sabado, December 11, alas 3 pa rin po ng hapon via YouTube Live. And for any questions po, any concerns about the training, again, we reiterate the use of the Facebook community page, Assessment PD Participants. Julie, may nakalimutan pa ba ako?
Oh, wala naman na X. This ends the first synchronous session for Module 1B-Math. We hope that this has strengthened your learning and inspired you to look forward to the next asynchronous and synchronous sessions. We look forward to seeing you next time. Xerxes, maraming
Salamat po.